Why? Being a good Christian wife is not the same as being a silent one. Silence is not obedience. The thing that everyone calls godliness might be the very thing that is killing the woman of God from the inside. This needs to be said because Christian women are disappearing, not from their homes or their churches, but from their own lives. They are praised for it, called faithful, held up as examples, and they are dying inside while everyone applauds. The tired Christian woman knows exactly what this means. She has felt it, that slow erasure, that gradual fading where she becomes less and less herself while becoming more and more what everyone needs her to be. She has been told this is what a godly wife looks like. Quiet, uncomplaining, always serving, never demanding to be seen. But here's what no one is saying out loud. What if the silence that has been called submission is actually something else entirely? What if everything she has been taught about being a good Christian wife has been leading her away from God instead of toward Him? Stay here, because what comes next will either confirm what has been buried deep inside, or it will expose a lie that has been dressed up as biblical truth for far too long. The overwhelmed Christian woman sits in this tension every single day. She serves breakfast with a quiet smile. She manages schedules, soothes conflicts, absorbs emotions that belong to everyone else. She prays faithfully, reads her devotional for women in the stolen moments between laundry and lunch preparations, and tells herself that exhaustion is the cost of faithfulness. People call her strong. They admire her patience. They point to her as an example of what a godly wife should be. And yet, late at night, when the house finally settles into silence, she lies awake with a question that terrifies her. Why does doing everything right still feel so wrong? This is not a question born of rebellion. This is the cry of an emotionally drained soul who has given everything and somehow lost herself in the giving. The overwhelmed wife knows this feeling. She has carried it for years, perhaps tucked beneath the smile she wears to church, hidden behind the social media posts about grateful hearts and blessed lives. She has learned not to name it, not to examine it too closely, because to do so might mean acknowledging that something sacred inside her has been shrinking. And if she acknowledges that, what does it say about her faith? What does it say about her marriage? What does it say about the life she has built on the foundation of submission and service? The daily rhythm is familiar to anyone who has lived it. Wake before dawn to seek God in the quiet, though the quiet often feels more like loneliness than peace. Prepare meals that nourish bodies while her own spirit grows thinner. Mediate conflicts between children while her own inner conflict remains unspoken. Support a husband's dreams while her own calling sits untended in the corner of her heart. Pray for her family with fervor. Lift them up in prayer for mothers and prayer for wives. Intercede for their struggles and their growth, all while wondering who is praying for the parts of her that are slowly dying from neglect. This is the life of the tired Christian woman who serves faithfully, prays quietly, endures patiently, and the world calls this beautiful. The church calls this biblical. But something inside keeps whispering that faithfulness should not feel like erasure, that devotion to family should not require the death of self, that being a godly wife should not mean becoming a woman without a voice, without desires, without the courage to speak truth, even when truth disrupts the comfortable patterns everyone has come to expect. God sees your pain. This must be said clearly before anything else can be spoken, before the tension is examined, before the questions are asked, before the answers are given. God sees your pain. He sees the woman who carries too much, who feels unseen as a wife, who wonders if anyone would notice if she finally broke under the weight of it all. He sees the Christian wife's struggles that no one talks about in Bible study. He sees the way strength has been confused with silence and submission with self-annihilation. He sees, and his heart aches for what his daughters have been taught to believe about themselves. But here is where the divide appears, where those who see begin to separate from those who sleep. There are Christian women who have started to wake up to a truth that the world finds threatening. They have begun to notice that the cultural expectations placed upon them do not always align with the spiritual truth found in Scripture. They have started to question whether the version of godly marriage they have been taught is actually biblical, or whether it is something else entirely, something shaped more by tradition and patriarchy than by the heart of God. The world that confuses peace with absence of voice cannot understand these women. It sees their questions as rebellion. It interprets their weariness as weakness of faith. It mistakes their longing for wholeness as selfishness, their desire to be seen and heard as pride. But the woman of God who has begun to wake knows something different. She knows that the ache inside her is not rebellion against God, but a response to his call. She knows that feeling alone in marriage is not the same as being difficult or demanding. She knows that being emotionally invisible while being labeled strong and godly is a contradiction that Scripture itself would never endorse. There is a version of goodness that people praise, and then there is the goodness that heaven recognizes. They are not always the same thing. The people who surround the overwhelmed mom might celebrate her tireless service, her uncomplaining nature, her ability to keep everyone happy at the expense of her own emotional and spiritual health. But heaven sees something different. Heaven sees a daughter made in the image of a speaking God, a woman created with words inside her that were meant to be released into the world, silenced by a teaching that mistook quietness for holiness. This is where the spiritual unease settles in, where the holy dissatisfaction begins to pulse beneath the surface of daily life. It is the quiet ache that prayer for wives sometimes carries, the sense that something is not right, even though everything looks right from the outside. The Proverbs 31 woman has become an impossible standard, a checklist of virtues that somehow requires a woman to be everything for everyone while being nothing for herself. She works with eager hands. She provides food for her household. She speaks with wisdom. She watches over the affairs of her family. But somewhere along the way, the church forgot that this woman also speaks. She opens her mouth with wisdom. She does not sit in perpetual silence, waiting for permission to exist fully. The spiritual burnout that so many Christian women carry is not a sign of weak faith. It is often a sign of faith that has been misdirected, poured into a vessel that was never meant to hold it. When devotion becomes the same as depletion, when service becomes the same as self-erasure, when being a good Christian wife means slowly disappearing from your own story, something has gone terribly wrong. And the guilt that rises up in response to these realizations is not the voice of God. It is the voice of a system that benefits from women who do not ask questions, who do not demand to be seen, who accept emotional invisibility as the price of being called faithful. Let guilt surface, yes, but not as condemnation. Let it surface as sorrow for what has been slowly surrendered, for the dreams that were set aside without ever being named, for the gifts that were buried because there was no time or energy left to cultivate them, for the voice that was trained to soften and shrink until it became almost inaudible, even to the woman herself. This sorrow is not sin. This sorrow is the Spirit grieving over what was lost in the name of a version of godliness that God Himself never ordained. Scripture carries a truth that has been withheld, filtered through interpretations that serve certain structures more than they serve the heart of God. The Bible is full of women who spoke when silence would have destroyed their purpose. Women who interceded, who prophesied, who challenged, who led, who questioned, who acted with courage even when it disrupted the expectations placed upon them. These women were not rebels. They were faithful. They understood something that has been forgotten, that God values truth spoken in love more than he values peace maintained through silence. The biblical atmosphere is thick with the stories of women who refuse to disappear. They shimmer in the background of narratives that often focus on men. But they are there, speaking, acting, changing the course of history through their willingness to be seen and heard. They trusted God enough to believe that he had given them voices for a purpose, that their words carried weight, that their perspective mattered in the unfolding of his kingdom. They did not mistake submission for silence. They did not confuse obedience with erasure. In this moment, before the answer comes, there is an invitation. The woman of God who has carried too much for too long, who has felt the sacred parts of herself shrinking under the weight of expectations, is invited to pause, not to fix anything, not to make a decision, not to share or act or perform, just to pause and whisper a prayer for women that comes from the deepest part of the heart. God, restore my strength. Let this be a moment of stillness where nothing is required except honesty before the one who already knows. This is not a technique. This is not a strategy. This is an act of faith for women who have forgotten that they are allowed to need God for themselves, not just for their families. This moment of prayer is for women's spiritual growth, for the encouragement for women who have spent years encouraging everyone else. It is a breath taken in the presence of God, a recognition that he is not only interested in what can be given to others, but in the wholeness of his daughters. Strength for women does not come from doing more or being less. It comes from returning to the source, from allowing God to speak into the places that have been silenced, from believing that he cares about the woman behind the roles, behind the titles, behind the expectations. The cost of misunderstood submission is higher than anyone wants to acknowledge. When a godly wife believes that endurance is the same as holiness, she loses something essential. She begins to confuse suffering with sanctification, as if the pain itself is proof of faithfulness. She teaches her children, often without meaning to, that love looks like one person diminishing so that others can expand. She shows her daughters that being a woman of faith means learning to live with chronic emotional hunger. She shows her sons that wives are meant to be silent supporters rather than full partners, present but not truly visible. The Christian motherhood burnout that so many women experience is not just about the practical demands of raising children. It is about the spiritual and emotional erosion that happens when a woman is taught that her value lies entirely in what she can give to others, never in who she is as a beloved daughter of God. It is about the slow realization that the version of biblical womanhood she has been taught might be more cultural than scriptural, more about maintaining certain power dynamics than about reflecting the heart of Christ. What is lost in this misunderstanding is not just the well-being of individual women, though that would be reason enough to grieve. What is lost is the fullness of what God intended for marriages, for families, for the church. When half the body is silenced, the whole body suffers. When women are taught that their wisdom, their insight, their prophetic voice is less valuable than their ability to serve quietly, the church loses the benefit of gifts God gave for the building up of his people. When Christian women learn to associate godliness with self-erasure, something of the image of God is obscured. Scripture is about to speak clearly and finally, cutting through the centuries of interpretation that have been layered over it, returning to the source, to the words themselves, and what they actually say, rather than what tradition has made them mean. Being a good Christian wife is not the same as being a silent one, because Scripture itself commands women to speak. The Proverbs 31 woman, held up as the model of biblical womanhood, opens her mouth with wisdom. She speaks with faithful instruction. Her husband trusts her judgment. Her voice is not something he tolerates, but something he relies on. She is praised not for her silence, but for her strength, her wisdom, her industry, her ability to manage and lead and make decisions that affect the welfare of her entire household. Biblical submission was never meant to be one-directional silence. It was meant to be mutual yielding, husband and wife both submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. It was meant to be a partnership where both voices matter, where both perspectives are valued, where decisions are made together rather than imposed by one upon the other. The Scripture that calls wives to submit also calls husbands to love as Christ loved the church, giving himself up, considering the other more important, laying down privilege and power for the sake of the beloved. This is mutual. This is partnership. This is not a hierarchy where one voice matters and the other must remain silent. Biblical submission includes voice. It includes discernment. It includes the courage rooted in faith to speak truth even when truth is uncomfortable, even when it disrupts the patterns that have become familiar. It includes the right to be seen, to be heard, to be known as a full person rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. The godly wife is not a woman who has learned to shrink. She is a woman who has learned to trust God enough to be fully herself, to offer her gifts without apology, to speak her wisdom without shame. The women in Scripture who are held up as examples of faith were not silent. Sarah spoke. Deborah led and judged and went into battle. Abigail intervened with wisdom that saved lives, going directly against her husband's foolish decisions. Esther spoke up at great personal risk to save her people. Mary pondered things in her heart. Yes, but she also spoke a prophetic song that shook the foundations of worldly power. The woman at the well became an evangelist, running back to her city to tell everyone about Jesus. These women were faithful. They were also fully present, fully visible, fully voiced. The Christian encouragement video, the messages for women, the Christian support for women that actually transforms, is not the message that godliness equals silence. It is the message that godliness equals faithfulness. And faithfulness sometimes requires speaking up, standing up, showing up fully as the person God created. It is the message God comfort me that acknowledges pain while also pointing toward wholeness. It is the recognition that feeling alone in marriage is not God's design. That feeling unseen as a wife is not what Scripture teaches. That carrying too much is not a badge of honor, but a sign that something needs to change. The question is no longer whether silence is holy. The question is whether obedience has been misunderstood all along. Whether the teachings that have shaped Christian women's understanding of their role have been drawn more from culture than from Scripture. Whether the time has come to return to what God actually said, rather than what tradition has made it mean. Whether the woman of God who has been hiding behind silence is ready to trust that her voice matters, that her wisdom has value, that her presence is meant to be felt and not just endured. This is not about rebellion. This is about returning. Not to a lesser version of faith, but to a fuller one. Not to selfishness, but to the self that God created and called good. Not to chaos, but to the partnership that reflects the way Christ relates to his church, with love that sees and knows and values fully. The overwhelmed Christian woman does not need to stay overwhelmed. The tired Christian woman does not need to stay tired. The emotionally drained woman does not need to accept depletion as the cost of faithfulness. God, restore my strength is not just a prayer for survival. It is a prayer for transformation. It is a prayer that acknowledges something has been wrong and asks God to make it right. It is a prayer that trusts God enough to believe that He wants more for His daughters than lives of quiet desperation disguised as devotion. It is a prayer for women's spiritual growth that does not stop at endurance but reaches for abundance, not of things or achievements, but of life lived fully in the freedom Christ died to give. Heaven defines goodness differently than people do. Heaven sees the woman behind the titles, behind the roles, behind the expectations. Heaven values the voice that has been silenced, grieves over the gifts that have been buried, celebrates when the daughter finally believes she is allowed to be fully present in her own life. Heaven recognizes that being a good Christian wife and being a silent one are not only different things, but sometimes opposite things. That the goodness God calls women to includes wisdom spoken, truth shared, presence felt, voice heard. The biblical seal of authority has been placed on this truth. It is not opinion. It is not preference. It is not cultural adaptation. It is Scripture itself, properly understood, freed from the interpretations that have served systems of power more than they have served the heart of God. The woman who speaks with wisdom is praised in Proverbs. The wife who partners fully with her husband is the model shown throughout Scripture. The voices of women are heard throughout the Bible, and they are never silenced by God Himself. So the invitation stands, lingering in the air like an unanswered question. Not because the answer has not been given, but because the application is personal, intimate, requiring courage that only the Spirit can provide. The Christian woman who has learned to be silent must now learn whether that silence has been obedience or fear, whether it has protected her calling or buried it, whether it has served her marriage or slowly undermined it by teaching her husband to live with half a partner and her children to accept less than what God intended for the relationships that shape their lives. Discernment is required. Prayer is essential. Spiritual encouragement from other women who have walked this path before can provide strength for the journey. But the journey itself must be taken. The question must be faced. The truth must be acknowledged. Being a good Christian wife is not the same as being a silent one. And the woman who finally believes this, who finally trusts that God gave her a voice for a reason, who finally dares to speak wisdom in love even when it disrupts the comfortable patterns everyone has come to expect. That woman is not stepping away from faithfulness. She is stepping into it.